I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My little cabin by the lake was my sanctuary, my escape from emails, deadlines, and the endless noise of the city. The air smelled like pine, and the water shimmered under the early morning sun. I had my fishing gear packed, a cooler with sandwiches, and absolutely no plans to interact with anyone, especially not the local home owners association. You might think living in a community with strict rules is relaxing, but the truth is, some people take it way too seriously. Enter Karen. She was the kind of person who knew every rule in the HOA handbook and probably memorized them in alphabetical order. Rumor had it she had a clipboard permanently attached to her hand and a radar for any perceived wrongdoing. She had the uncanny ability to spot an untrimmed bush from a mile away and could quote HOA bylaws while standing on one foot. As I pulled my little boat into the water, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Today, it was just me, the fish, and the gentle rustling of the trees. I had planned to spend the morning casting my line, enjoying the quiet, maybe catching a big one. It was the kind of peace you dream about when stuck in a cubicle, staring at spreadsheets. Little did I know, peace was about to become an endangered species. I had just baited my hook and was preparing for the first cast when I heard a crunch behind me. Someone was walking fast through the underbrush, snapping twigs under their feet. It was unmistakably Karen. She appeared from nowhere, eyes wide, chest puffed out, and hands waving like she was about to conduct an orchestra. "You can't be fishing here," she shouted. Her voice carried across the lake, startling a nearby duck that quacked indignantly. "The HOA rules clearly state." She didn't even finish before whipping out her phone and dialing. I blinked at her. Hi," I said. "I think you might want to check the property records. This cabin is mine." She ignored me. Of course, she ignored me. Karen had two modes, fury and fury with a phone. I tried again. "Look, I know the rules and I'm following them. I have the right to fish here." She scoffed. "The rules apply to everyone. No exceptions," she said, glaring at me as though I had just confessed to committing a felony. I could see her fingers moving rapidly on the phone, probably describing me as the most dangerous fisherman in history. I wanted to laugh, but the approaching sound of sirens made my stomach tighten. At first, I thought it might be a joke. Who would call the cops over a fishing rod? But then I realized Karen wasn't joking. She was deadly serious. She was convinced that her moral duty as an HOA enforcer outweighed common sense, legality, and frankly, the sheer absurdity of the situation. While I watched, she gave an exaggerated wave to the imaginary neighbors, as if signaling them that justice was being served. It was both terrifying and ridiculous. I tried to reason again. "Listen, I'm legally allowed to fish here. It's my property. Everything I'm doing is fine." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't care if it's your property. I'm calling the cops." I sighed. It was going to be one of those weekends, wasn't it? The kind that started peacefully and ended with flashing lights, paperwork, and one very angry HOA member. I grabbed my fishing rod a little tighter, took a deep breath, and prepared to defend my right to enjoy the lake. And then I heard it, the faint wail of sirens in the distance. My heart raced, not because I was in trouble, but because I knew this was about to get interesting. The peace I had envisioned for the weekend evaporated like morning fog over the water. I cast my line anyway, hoping the fish wouldn't notice the chaos, and braced myself for the showdown that was about to unfold. Little did Karen know, this weekend wasn't going to go the way she planned. She had no idea who she was dealing with. It was just me, the lake, and the impending arrival of the police. And somehow, I had a feeling this was going to be a story I would laugh about for years. The sound of sirens grew louder, echoing off the trees, bouncing across the lake. I could feel my heart rate pick up, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. I had no idea how this was about to play out, but I knew one thing. Karen was about to experience a surprise she wasn't prepared for. I looked over at her, phone still pressed to her ear, muttering about some violation that had apparently shaken the foundations of our entire neighborhood. Her eyes darted to the lake, then back to me, like she was trying to gauge how much trouble she could get me into before reality intervened. She didn't notice that the dock beneath her feet creaked ominously. Small details, I thought. Small details always get the best punchlines. As the first patrol car pulled up, I tried to keep my expression neutral. The officers stepped out, uniforms crisp, badges gleaming in the sun. One of them squinted at the lake, then at me, then at Karen. I waved politely. "Morning, officers. Beautiful day for fishing, isn't it?" They didn't answer immediately. Karen, on the other hand, launched into full speech mode. "They're violating HOA rules, illegal fishing. They don't even own this property properly." She gestured wildly, nearly tipping herself into the water. I had to bite back a laugh. Watching her flail like a startled heron was simultaneously terrifying and hilarious. One officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, can you explain what's going on?" he asked, calm and professional, clearly used to mediating small-town chaos. "Yes," Karen exclaimed. "This person right here is clearly disregarding HOA regulations. Fishing when it's not allowed, it's a threat to our community standards." She puffed out her chest, as if she were about to be knighted for her bravery. I cleared my throat. "Officers, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I actually own this property. I have every legal right to fish here." I tried to keep my tone calm, but there was a hint of amusement creeping in. Karen didn't even flinch. She was too busy building her case in the air. The officers exchanged a look. I could almost see the thought bubbles forming above their heads. This wasn't going to be as simple as just handing out a warning. They were sizing up the situation, silently wondering how one small cabin by a lake had become the epicenter of HOA warfare. Karen, oblivious to their skepticism, continued. "This is exactly what happens when people think rules are optional. Next thing you know, they'll be planting illegal flowers and letting their mailboxes lean a fraction of an inch." She gestured toward me, as though I had personally offended the natural order of the universe. One officer finally spoke. "Ma'am, do you have any proof that you own this property?" I pulled out my property deed, casually holding it like it was a fishing rod instead of a legal document. "Right here. Everything's in order. I'm allowed to fish, swim, even have small gatherings here as long as it's within the law." Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a goldfish. She couldn't comprehend that her carefully constructed moral outrage had hit a legal wall. She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but no words came out. Silence fell over the dock, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the wooden posts. One of the officers leaned toward me, whispering just loud enough for me to hear. "So you actually live here, or is this just a weekend thing?" I nodded, still trying to keep my face neutral. I could feel the corners of my mouth twitching. Karen was losing ground fast. Just as I thought she might admit defeat, she attempted a heroic escape. She started pointing at the lake and yelling about community safety, but in her haste, she stumbled on the dock. Luckily, she didn't fall in, but the officers couldn't help but exchange amused glances. I had to suppress a laugh. It was a perfect comedic moment, one I would replay in my head for weeks. I reeled in my line, trying to act nonchalant. The fish didn't seem to care about HOA disputes or police presence. They were still swimming happily in the lake, oblivious to the chaos above. As the officers took notes, I could feel the tension shifting. Karen's moral authority was crumbling and the lake remained mine. I knew the weekend was far from over, but for now the scales were tipping in my favor. The suspense wasn't gone, it was just waiting for the next act. And I had a feeling the next act was going to be even more interesting than this one. The officers were still standing there, calm and professional, taking notes and occasionally glancing at Karen like she was a minor inconvenience rather than a neighborhood hero in her own mind. I could see her confidence slipping, her moral armor cracking with every passing second. She had spent weeks preparing for this confrontation, and now she looked like she had just walked into quicksand. I decided it was time to add a little twist, something that would make her sputter even more. "Officers," I said casually, as if mentioning the weather, "I actually lease this cabin to the state police for training exercises. Sometimes they use it for weekend drills, sometimes for field operations." The world seemed to pause. Karen's eyes went wide and her phone nearly dropped from her hand. The officers exchanged looks, eyebrows raising in silent acknowledgement. I could almost see the gears turning in their heads. Oh, that explains it. Karen's face turned pale. "W what?" she stammered. "State police here, in my neighborhood." She took a step back, like I had just dropped a bomb on the entire community. The clipboard in her hand wobbled dangerously, as though it too was shocked by the revelation. I kept my tone calm, almost bored, as if I was simply stating a fact about the weather. Yes, the cabin is officially leased to the state police. They have all the permits and rights to use it, and that includes me as the owner enjoying the lake. Her mouth opened, closed, and opened again. I could see the mental gymnastics she was attempting. She was trying to reconcile her rigid HOA worldview with the reality that the law and the state police were firmly on my side. It was a sight to behold, a mixture of horror, confusion, and humiliation. One of the officers stepped forward, a faint smirk on his face. "Ma'am, it seems like everything is in order here. The property is legally owned and the cabin is used officially by the state police. I'm not sure there's anything to investigate." Karen looked like someone had just told her gravity didn't exist. She waved her arms helplessly. But the community, the rules, what about standards?" I leaned back against the railing of the dock, feeling a strange mixture of amusement and vindication. Sometimes, Karen, the rules you care about so much don't apply when real authority steps in. In this case, the state police have jurisdiction, and apparently they enjoy fishing too. She opened her mouth again, ready to argue, but no words came. The officers exchanged quiet chuckles behind their hands, and I could see Karen slowly realizing she had miscalculated. This was no ordinary weekend dispute. She had stumbled into a scenario far beyond her HOA powers. To add a little more dramatic flair, I casually mentioned, "In fact, they might be arriving later today for a small exercise. So if anyone sees uniforms on the trail, don't panic. It's all planned." Karen's eyes nearly bugged out of her head. She muttered something about "this is illegal" and "I'm protecting the neighborhood" before trailing off, clearly outmatched and outmaneuvered. I had to suppress a laugh. She looked like a cartoon character who had just walked into a trapdoor. I could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The officers were now relaxed, maybe even entertained, while Karen was teetering on the edge of complete meltdown. I reeled in my fishing line slowly, enjoying the quiet tension. Every tug of the rod reminded me of the absurdity of the situation. One woman, armed with a clipboard and a phone, versus law, logic, and the state police. The lake remained serene, almost mocking the chaos on the dock. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, the sun sparkled on the water, and for a moment, I felt the perfect balance of calm and mischief. Karen, meanwhile, tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, but it was gone. Her moral high ground had crumbled into a pile of panic and disbelief. I looked at the officers and smiled faintly. Well, now that the rules are clear, I think I'll continue fishing. One officer gave a nod, and Karen's face twisted into a mix of horror and reluctant admiration. She had underestimated me, underestimated the law, and underestimated how absurdly peaceful fishing could become even in the middle of an HOA showdown. And just like that, the suspense didn't vanish, it shifted. Karen's defeat was only temporary, and the lake, the cabin, and the promise of state police drills created a tension that promised the weekend was far from over. The next act was coming, and I could already imagine the chaos it would bring. Karen stood there, frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. The sun reflected off her clipboard and glasses, making her look like some kind of overzealous HOA statue. I could almost hear the cogs in her brain turning, desperately trying to figure out how she had gone from neighborhood hero to neighborhood punchline in under 5 minutes. The officers, calm as ever, were taking notes but clearly suppressing smiles. I could tell they were enjoying this more than they should. Karen had been so certain that her moral righteousness would sway the situation, but now the reality of legal authority and my subtle reveal was sinking in. She looked like she was about to faint or call for backup, probably both. I decided to give her a little nudge. "You know, Karen," I said, keeping my tone casual, "I completely understand your dedication to the neighborhood. Really, it's admirable. But maybe next time, before you call the cops on someone, you might want to check the property records first." Her eyes widened. Her lips trembled. I think she was about to argue, but she realized that anything she said would only make her look worse. Her silence was deafening. For a moment, it felt like time itself had paused on the dock, giving the lake a chance to mock her silently. Then in a final desperate act, she tried to assert control. Well, I was just trying to protect everyone," she yelled, pointing at me like I had personally offended the entire HOA. "You can't just ignore the rules because," her voice trailed off. She had no words, she had nothing. The entire argument had crumbled in the face of legality, logic, and a hint of state police involvement. One of the officers cleared his throat and said calmly, "Ma'am, as long as the property is legally owned and the owner has permission to use it, and as long as no laws are being broken, I don't see a problem here." Karen blinked rapidly, her face turning shades of red, pink, and probably purple. She opened her mouth to argue again, but I could see it. The mental defeat had already begun to set in. She looked like someone trying to yell underwater. I leaned back against the railing, letting the suspense linger. It was almost theatrical. The birds were chirping, the lake was calm, and Karen was slowly realizing that she was completely out of her depth. My fishing rod rested in my hands, a perfect symbol of quiet authority in the chaos of her meltdown. Then she made a move that I did not expect. She started packing in small, furious circles, muttering about the sanctity of the neighborhood and community standards. The officers exchanged glances. I could almost hear their thoughts. Here comes the second act of Karen's epic meltdown. I decided to add just a little more suspense. "You know, officers," I said lightly, "I might be seeing some state police arriving later today for training. I assume that's within the scope of my lease, right?" Karen's eyes nearly popped out of her head. Her hands flew to her face, and I swear she made a noise somewhere between a gasp and a shriek. She couldn't process it. The rules she clung to so dearly were now meaningless. Legal authority and the state police had completely trumped her tiny HOA kingdom. The officers laughed quietly behind their hands, trying not to make her panic worse. I kept fishing, trying to appear as nonchalant as possible. The suspense hung in the air like mist over the water. Any second, something else could happen. A wrong word from Karen, a slip on the dock, or the arrival of actual state police could change everything. Karen, finally, gave a defeated sigh and sank onto a nearby bench, muttering about the neighborhood and how this could happen. She was clearly plotting her next move, though I suspected it would involve furious emails and passive-aggressive letters rather than any meaningful action. I cast my line again, feeling a sense of triumph. The lake was calm, the officers were entertained but professional, and Karen was temporarily defeated. Yet the suspense lingered. I knew this weekend was far from over. Karen's meltdown was only the beginning, and the true chaos and comedy was just around the corner. The sun glinted off the water, and I realized, weekends like this don't come often. Fishing, suspense, an overzealous HOA member, and state police involvement all in one day. It was absurd, dramatic, and perfectly entertaining. I couldn't wait to see how the next chapter unfolded. The suspense was alive, the stakes had risen, and Karen was officially on notice. But little did she know the best and most satisfying part of the story was still ahead. I was just settling back into my fishing routine, enjoying the calm of the lake, when I noticed a small convoy of vehicles winding down the gravel road toward the cabin. My stomach did a little flip. The state police were arriving for their weekend training exercises. I smiled to myself. Karen, on the other hand, was about to find out just how small her world really was. Her eyes widened the moment she saw the first uniformed officer step out of the car. What?" she stammered, clutching her clipboard like it was a life raft. "They can't just, what are they doing here?" she sputtered, panic creeping into her voice. I waved casually. "Good morning, officers," I called, standing up and giving them a small nod. "Nice day for training, isn't it?" The officers glanced at Karen, and I could see the unspoken communication. "This is the HOA lady who called us on the property owner for fishing." Suppressed the laughter. She was fumbling with her phone, probably considering calling for backup from the HOA board, but clearly unsure what to do when actual law enforcement was involved. One of the officers, a tall guy with a calm demeanor, approached Karen and asked politely, "Ma'am, can we help you with something?" She looked like she had been caught in a storm. Why, yes, this person right here is, she gestured wildly toward me, violating rules, illegal fishing, and this is not allowed in our neighborhood. The officer raised an eyebrow. I see, he said slowly, his tone polite but firm. And what exactly is being violated? Her eyes flicked between me and the officers. She didn't have an answer. She hadn't anticipated this. The paperwork she had spent hours preparing, the arguments she had rehearsed in front of her mirror, none of it mattered now. The people she thought she could intimidate were literally standing in full uniform. I couldn't help myself. I leaned on my fishing rod and said calmly, "Officers, as I mentioned earlier, this cabin is leased to the state police for training exercises. I also happen to own the property. Fishing here is completely legal, and as long as the exercises are scheduled, everything is perfectly above board." Karen's jaw dropped. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, like she was trying to form a coherent sentence, but the words refused to cooperate. Her moral certainty had evaporated in the face of real authority. One officer nodded toward me. "Everything appears to be in order," he said. "This property is legally owned and the owner has permission to use it. No laws are being broken. Ma'am, I'm going to suggest you step back and allow things to proceed." Karen staggered backward, muttering about community standards and rules being ignored. She looked like a cartoon character caught in a whirlwind. Her clipboard nearly slipped from her hands, and she grabbed it with an urgency that was both pathetic and hilarious. I reeled in my lines slowly, pretending to be nonchalant. The suspense in the air was electric. Karen had no idea what to do next. The state police were now fully present, and she was utterly powerless. The lake was calm, the birds were chirping, but the tension on the dock was palpable. The officers began setting up for their training exercises, moving with precision and purpose. I watched Karen try to intervene, waving her arms and shouting about rules, only to be gently redirected by an officer. It was like watching a child argue with gravity. She was outmatched in every possible way. I caught a small fish on my line and held it up for a moment, smiling faintly. "See, officers, just fishing, nothing illegal, nothing dangerous." One of them chuckled quietly. "Noted," he said, giving me a nod. Karen, however, looked like she had just discovered that the world she lived in was only a fraction of reality. As the officers continued their setup, Karen slowly sank onto a nearby bench, defeated. She muttered something about writing letters, organizing meetings, and making sure this doesn't happen again. But I knew her words had no weight. The real power in this scenario wasn't her clipboard or her phone. It was law, logic, and a well-timed lease agreement. I cast my line again, feeling the quiet thrill of victory. The suspense was still alive. Karen wasn't gone, and her indignation would probably fester. But for now, the lake was mine, the state police were in my corner, and Karen was officially humiliated. The weekend had started as a peaceful escape, and now it had become an absurdly dramatic showdown, complete with suspense, authority, and a touch of comedy. And I knew one thing for certain. This was a story that would be told, laughed about, and remembered for a long time. As I watched the state police set up for their training exercises, Karen sat on the bench, muttering to herself like she was delivering a one-woman protest against the universe. The clipboard rested on her lap, abandoned but still a symbol of her shattered authority. I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of the situation. I mean, here I was, just trying to enjoy a weekend fishing at my cabin, when the HOA decided that my peaceful morning was a crisis worthy of police intervention. And not just any police, state police. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same rules Karen had been waving around like a weapon had no power here, and she was learning it the hard way. As I cast my line into the lake, I thought about all the little obsessions of HOA life. Paint colors, mailbox alignment, lawn ornaments. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to follow the unwritten code that Karen seemed to worship. And yet, despite all her vigilance, life had a way of ignoring the rules when reality, legality, and actual authority intervened. Karen tried to regain some semblance of dignity. She straightened her back, clutched her clipboard tightly, and muttered something about reporting this and ensuring community compliance. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out how she could still emerge victorious. It was fascinating to watch, like a slow-motion comedy of errors. The officers continued their exercises, moving efficiently and professionally. Occasionally, they would glance at Karen, either suppressing laughter or giving subtle signals that she was, in fact, powerless in this situation. I caught one of them smiling at me, a small acknowledgement that yes, this was as ridiculous as it looked. I reflected on how HOA conflicts often escalate. Small disputes, petty rules, and personal vendettas can turn the simplest situations into full-blown dramas. I had seen it before in the city, but nothing prepared me for this. A serene cabin, a fishing rod, Karen, and state police. The stakes were absurd, yet the suspense was real. Karen attempted a slow approach toward me, probably hoping to salvage some authority. "Well, maybe," she began, her voice trembling. "Maybe we can find a compromise." I raised an eyebrow, trying to look both patient and amused. The suspense hung in the air. What compromise could there possibly be when legality, property rights, and state police training were all on my side? I let her ramble for a few moments, listening to her muttered justifications, her frantic attempts to reclaim power. And then I said, casually, "Karen, I appreciate your dedication, really, but sometimes rules need context. This is one of those times." Her face twisted in disbelief. The mental gears were grinding, and I could see the panic building again. The suspense wasn't over, it was shifting. She was recalibrating, trying to figure out how to respond to a situation that didn't fit her worldview. The lake reflected the afternoon sun, calm and serene, mocking the chaos that had erupted on its banks. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The absurdity of the HOA was on full display, and I was the unwitting protagonist in a story that was both suspenseful and hilarious. Karen finally sank back onto the bench, exhausted, muttering about letters, emails, and future complaints. I knew she wasn't gone. She was like a storm cloud, still hovering, still threatening, but powerless against the reality of the situation. I took another cast with my rod, feeling the familiar tug of a fish on the line. It was grounding, almost meditative. Yet the suspense lingered. Karen's presence, her obsession with rules, and the looming possibility of future HOA conflicts kept the tension alive. I realized that this weekend was about more than just fishing. It was a lesson in patience, humor, and navigating the absurdity of human behavior. The state police were now fully engaged in their exercises, officers moving with purpose, and Karen was defeated but still lingering. The stage was set for the next act, the final escalation. The suspense was building toward a climax, and I knew the audience, real or imagined, would be on the edge of their seats. As I reeled in my line and glanced at Karen, I couldn't help but smile. The absurdity, the humor, the drama, it was perfect. And deep down, I knew that the best part of this story, the part that would make Karen truly rethink her obsession with HOA rules, was still to come. The weekend had been a peaceful escape turned dramatic showdown, and the suspense was alive and thriving. Whatever happened next, I was ready, fishing rod in hand, prepared to see Karen's meltdown reach its peak. The afternoon sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the lake, and the suspense in the air was palpable. The state police were now fully engaged in their exercises, moving with quiet precision, and Karen was slowly realizing that her small kingdom of rules and bylaws held no sway here. The contrast was almost theatrical. She paced near the dock, muttering to herself, occasionally waving her arms in gestures of frustration that bordered on desperation. Every glance toward me was filled with a mix of horror, disbelief, and begrudging acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, she had underestimated the situation. I tried to act nonchalant, as if catching fish while state police trained around me was completely normal. One of the officers walked past, giving me a small nod, and Karen's jaw nearly hit the floor. She clutched her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white, as if sheer force could somehow restore her authority. The suspense in her eyes was almost tangible, and I knew she was replaying every moment of the morning, trying to figure out where she had gone wrong. I decided to stir the pot just a little. "You know, Karen," I said casually, keeping my tone light, "the officers here are great. They don't mind if I fish while they train. Maybe next time you could ask them first before calling the cops." Her eyes widened further. Her mouth opened, closed, and opened again, clearly struggling to find a response. She sputtered something about community standards and protecting the neighborhood, but it fell flat against the calm authority around her. The suspense was high. Every word she uttered seemed to crumble before it even left her lips. The state police, noticing her struggle, approached her politely. One officer said, "Ma'am, everything here is above board. The property owner has legal rights and the training exercises are scheduled. We're just doing our job. There's no issue." Karen's hands flew to her face. She whispered something inaudible, then muttered, But, the rules," she trailed off completely. Her authority, built on a lifetime of HOA obsession, had completely collapsed under the weight of reality and law. I leaned against my rod, feeling the thrill of quiet triumph. The suspense was electric. Karen was still present, still simmering, but utterly powerless. She had gone from confident enforcer of neighborhood morality to a woman frozen in disbelief, overwhelmed by the absurdity of the weekend. I cast my line again, letting the suspense hang in the air like mist over the lake. The fish didn't seem to care about HOA disputes, state police, or Karen's meltdown. They swam peacefully, reminding me that life sometimes just goes on, no matter how dramatic the humans around you get. Karen finally tried to retreat with a shred of dignity. She muttered about sending letters, organizing meetings, and ensuring this never happens again. The officers smiled politely, and I caught a hint of amusement in their eyes. It was obvious they had dealt with overzealous neighborhood disputes before, but this was something else entirely. I watched her slowly sit on the bench again, slumping in defeat. She crossed her arms, muttered under her breath, and avoided looking at me. The suspense shifted from external chaos to her internal struggle, trying to reconcile her rigid worldview with the undeniable reality that she had been completely outmaneuvered. The lake remained serene, a perfect contrast to the storm of absurdity on the dock. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. The weekend had started peacefully, escalated into chaos, and was now settling into a quiet victory. But the suspense lingered. Karen was defeated for now, but her obsession with rules and control suggested she might return in some form, ready to create more drama. I reeled in my line slowly, letting the moment sink in. The officers continued their exercises, the lake shimmered in the golden afternoon light, and Karen sat defeated but unbroken in spirit. It was a perfect mixture of suspense, humor, and drama, the kind of story that makes weekends unforgettable. I realized then that the best part of this story wasn't just the absurdity of the HOA or the arrival of the state police. It was the complete unraveling of Karen's authority, the tension of watching her face reality, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that for once, logic, legality, and calm humor had won. And yet the suspense was far from over. Weekends like this have a way of lingering in your mind, teasing you with the possibility of one more twist, one more confrontation, and one last dramatic moment. I leaned back, rod in hand, ready for whatever the next scene might bring, knowing that the grand finale was just around the corner. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden-orange reflections across the lake, and the suspense that had been building all weekend was reaching its peak. The state police were finishing up their exercises, packing up equipment with precision, and I could see Karen sitting on the bench, her clipboard forgotten, staring at the water like it had personally insulted her. I cast my line one last time, feeling the familiar tug of the lake and the absurdity of the weekend. This was it, the grand finale of what had started as a peaceful escape and turned into a full-blown HOA showdown. Every moment since Friday morning had led to this perfect, ridiculous climax. Karen finally stood, muttering about making sure this never happens again and enforcing community standards. She looked at me like she was about to storm off and concoct some new plan to regain her dignity. I could almost hear the wheels turning, furious emails, neighborhood meetings, perhaps even a complaint to the HOA board. She was defeated, yes, but far from gone. One of the officers approached me and gave a subtle nod. "Enjoy your fishing," he said quietly, and I smiled. It was acknowledgement that the absurdity had been observed and appreciated. Karen, however, had no such luxury of calm. She had to navigate the collapse of her moral universe in real time. I decided to deliver one last bit of suspense and humor. "Officers, thank you for coming out," I said lightly, "and for tolerating my HOA crisis. Karen here was very concerned about community rules, so I thought you might want a heads up." Karen's eyes nearly bugged out of her head. She sputtered incoherently, waving her arms in panic. Her moral authority, her imagined power over the neighborhood, and her belief in her omniscience had all crumbled like sandcastles at high tide. The suspense was delicious. The officers chuckled quietly, and I reeled in my line with exaggerated calm. The fish didn't seem to care about HOA conflicts, state police leases, or Karen's meltdown. They swam peacefully, reminding me that life often moves on, even when humans are losing their minds over tiny rules and regulations. Karen tried one last desperate maneuver. She opened her mouth, ready to argue to reassert her moral supremacy, but the words caught in her throat. The state police were now leaving, the equipment packed, and she had nothing left to wield. It was like watching a storm collapse into a puddle. Her expression said it all: disbelief, frustration, and the faintest hint of admiration that perhaps the world wasn't always about HOA bylaws. I cast my line again, the suspense lingering like mist over the water. This was my moment of quiet triumph. The weekend had been transformed from peaceful relaxation to absurd drama, and now it was winding down. Karen was defeated, the officers were gone, and the lake was mine once more. As I sat there, rod in hand, I reflected on the events. HOA rules can escalate quickly, small disputes can turn into absurd showdowns, and people can overestimate their own authority. Humor, patience, and a little legal knowledge can turn the tables in the most unexpected ways. I chuckled quietly to myself, imagining how this story would be retold in the neighborhood for months. Karen finally stood and left the dock, muttering under her breath, still clutching her clipboard. She was a force of nature that had been briefly contained, but she would return, no doubt, in some form. The suspense wasn't gone entirely. It had merely shifted into the anticipation of future encounters. I took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling my lungs, and cast my line one last time. The fish tugged gently, reminding me that simple pleasures exist even amid chaos. The state police had shown up, authority had been established, and Karen had been humbled in a way only dramatic irony can deliver. I smiled, realizing the weekend had given me more than fishing. It had given me a story full of suspense, humor, and drama. A story where patience, calmness, and knowing your rights turned the tide against an overzealous HOA member. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lake glowed with a golden light, peaceful once more. Karen's meltdown had reached its peak. The state police had completed their exercises, and I had successfully fished without interruption. The absurdity, the tension, and the humor all came together perfectly, leaving me with a sense of triumph and a story I would never forget. And as I reeled in my final catch, I whispered to myself, "Weekends like this don't come often, but when they do, you enjoy the fish, the chaos, and every absurd second of it." You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.